In this video, we're going to take a look at Montegrappa dark blue or blue black. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. You know, I like blue black inks, and to be fair, it does say that this is blue black or dark blue, giving it potentially an out if they maybe made a mistake. Now, as a blue black, it is much too light a blue leaning of a blue black for me. I would prefer the blue part of it to be a bit darker than this. Also, this is not a dark blue. It's a lighter blue. As a light blue black, though, it does shade fairly well, just not very often with a lot of the papers. Like, you can see it there. It's there. It's just kind of there. It sounds so horrible. I can't say that I really enjoyed using this. And here is an ink that I am very happy that I sampled so that I know not to get a bottle of it. Now, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the ink. It does mean that there's something wildly wrong with this ink for me. It does not do what I want my blue blacks to do in how they look. It is, for me, in every way wrong from what I would want. But that doesn't mean that it performs bad or has any kind of behavior issues. Just definitely wrong for me. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Sailor 1911 Standard with a music nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. I'm going to start out by saying, when you're seeing this, you see the word Monteverde at the top. It is Montegrappa, and I don't know what happened there. Mistakes. I'm human. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get some very light shading, as in we have the occasional moment where it is a little darker, like at the top of the T's, for instance. We tend to get it a little darker there, not much else. And it's really a much lighter blue than you would have expected for a blue-black, as I had said. Looking at the medium nib, it's much darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread. It does shade a whole lot better than the fine did. You can actually see some shading in the writing, so at least it's starting to give some of that. Now, when it shades darker, it looks much better. The broad nib is, in general, a little darker than the medium. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does give a little bit of shading, but not as much shading as the medium nib did. I think the medium was doing very well, and that's a wet medium. Looking at the back of the page, we see no ghosting and we got no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Pierre Cardin President with a medium nib, a Diplomat Arrow with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, it looks a little bit darker than what we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get a little bit more shading than we got on the Clairfontaine, which is a bit backwards from normal. I think the tone paper is helping this ink quite a bit. Now, it is certainly not a dark ink even from that fine. Not a dark blue. The medium is much darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, and it does have some shading that's going on. You see the is much darker than Professor, and I don't understand why that was. The pen wasn't sitting for very long. Looking on the second line, you see the word by has quite a bunch of shading in it. The has shading, power has shading. So there's definitely shading available with this ink. The broad nib is the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread, not as good a shading as we got in the medium, and what happened in the medium wasn't especially stand out, it was just better than the fine. Looking at the back of the page, we got no bleed through that touched the page underneath, and we got a normal amount of ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we have much lighter tone than we had on the Leuchtterm. Light, a little bit darker than the Clairefontaine, but kind of disappointing as a tone here. Now, it does have no feather. It does not have spread. It doesn't really have shading. Yeah, it's just there. I mean, it's writing very well, and if you like the tone of this ink, then this is a great ink to be using in that fine nib. The medium is much darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It shades a whole lot better than the fine does, although it doesn't go out of its way to give you any shading. It's like it happens accidentally every now and then. And, I mean, you can see it in the word philosophy a little. The word in is a little darker than the words around, so there is technically some there. Just kind of, sorry, don't mean to make it sound that way. The broad nib is about the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread, almost no shading. Now, almost no shading because at the end of some of the words, it seems to get a little bit darker, but only at the end of the words. It doesn't do it at all during the words, just as an afterthought. Looking at the back of the page, we see minimal ghosting and we got no bleed through that touched the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, yeesh, that's bad. It's really light and washed out and horrific to use if you're a note taker as a tone. Unless you like it to be that light, then good for you, not me. There's no feather, there is no spread, there actually is a little bit of shading, but while this paper is making it much lighter, at least it shows off that they can shade, I guess, with a fine nib. The medium is significantly darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It's shading better, I think, here than it has on some other papers, which is really strange, but I do think some of this writing looks better than it did on some of the better papers. The broad nib is a little bit darker as its general midtones than what we had with the medium, not the darker tones of the medium. That broad nib has no feather, it has no spread, it only has a couple of moments where some darker spots occur that we could call shading if we wanted to lie to ourselves that it did shade. Looking at the back of the page, we see a minimal of ghosting and we got no bleeding that touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Blue Black. Here is Noodler's Blue Black. Here is Noodler's Aircore Blue Black. Here is Roher & Klinger Lipstiger Schwarz. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get some shading. It is still just too light, and I mean, I can read it. It's there. It is. It's just, it's there. It is. Okay. Looking at the medium nib, it's much darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It's shading fairly well on this paper. It's giving some very dark spots along with a lot of those midtones. So it is looking the best from that wet medium. Are you seeing how this is going? The broad nib is about the same tone as the midtones from the medium. It has no feather, it has no spread, it's got a few light shading spots. When it shades to darker, it doesn't shade as dark as the medium did. And it still just kind of looks, there. Yeah, look, that's definitely, you wrote something. It doesn't look interesting, but you wrote something. Looking at the back of the page, we see a minimal amount of ghosting on this paper, and we got no bleed through touching the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a brown ink by Birmingham Pen Company's Shady Side Walnut Street Brown. Here is a black ink by Montegrappa Black. Here is a red ink by Pen BBS, their number 175 Stendhal. Here is a pink ink by Sailor, their Kobe number 30 Ouija Cherry. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get a bit of feather, and you see it right away with the word new. There's going to be tiny feathers all over it, and that's okay. We do get a minor amount of spread, but it's really manageable with this fine nib. Believe it or not, a little bit of shading is showing up here, although it's not really adding much to this writing. I hate that it sounds so negative, and I'm sorry, but that's just how it's going to be, because I'm not redoing this. I don't like it. Looking at the medium nib, it's a bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has a few moments of shading. Just kidding. It has feather, it has spread. It doesn't shade. It's there, it's yuck. Okay. Looking at the broad nib, it feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade. It is darker than the medium. It is definitely the darkest tone on the page. If what you want is the darkest gross tone you can get, I am so sorry. I don't do this very often, but I do not like how this looks. Looking at the back of the page, we had no bleeding that touched the page underneath, so it performed very well there. And looking at where the writing is, considering the paper, the ghosting is fairly under control, although it is definitely there. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The hard part here is when I really didn't enjoy an ink in trying to find the pen that would make it the most enjoyable for me from what I've seen and what I've done with it. So I would like this to be a little bit darker by using a real gusher of a medium or a fine nib. I think that maybe that's going to be a good way to go to get it. I don't think anything putting down wider lines is really going to help you here. And I think the best I can do is darken it as much as possible and hope to get a good dark blue or maybe some towards that blue black. I'm going to apologize to anybody that really likes this ink, as I really don't and haven't enjoyed using it. So I'm going to apologize for that. Thanks for watching.